Jerry Nunley, who is Director for Corporate and Foundation Affairs for Harvard University. And two members of our advisory committee who could not be with us tonight are Joe Warren, who is the Director for Community Affairs for Northeastern University, and Fran Farmer, who is President of Trans-Africa and former Executive Director of the Congressional Black Caucus. Crossroads, sorry. But the three people that I would like to single out for some special recognition are the members of the Cox Committee. Oftentimes, as many of you are aware, that when you engage in any endeavor, a number of people we always talk about that we're willing to do the work, that we'll commit the time, and generally the work falls on several people. And luckily, the people that it fell on this time carried the ball, and I think that they deserve some special recognition, and they certainly deserve a round of applause from us for the work they've done. One is Melvin Hollis, who is the chair of our Cox Committee this year. Please stand, Melvin. The other two people are standing in the wings, but at least they're standing. Brian Salter, Marlene Tarpley. And now I would like to turn things over to Dean Allison.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for an event that we've all looked forward to, this second Cox Lecture. And our topic, as you know, is the black community in the post-civil rights era, challenges to public policy. We could not have three more distinguished panelists to address this question, and my part in it is to serve as a bit as a referee and to introduce the other speakers, the speaker and the two commenters. I spent this morning, as I was saying to John earlier, down at the Ford Foundation, talking to them about a project that we're considering here at the school on poverty and the possibility of a study of longer-term poverty. So let me just say a word about that because I think it's illustrative of what this panel is helping to address. Imagine, if you would, for a moment, that you had been born in America in 1970. I don't think we have anybody in the audience that young, but imagine you had been born in 1970. What's the odds that you would have grown up poor, that is, spent more than 7 of your first 10 years in poverty? Answer, 7%. Now let's imagine that you would just, being born in 1970, have happened to be born into a white family, white two-parent family. What's the chance that you grew up poor? 2%. What? 3%, sorry. If you had been born into a black family in 1970, what's the chance that you grew up poor? 35%. Now let's imagine that you had been born just by bad luck into a one-parent, female-headed household. If you were born into a one-parent, female-headed household, the chance that you grew up poor in America, born in 1970, is 60%. Now, the causes of this conjury of problems, which are not unrelated to our topic tonight, the causes are not unrelated to patterns of prejudice about race and about sex in American society, and the remedies are not unrelated to the traditional civil rights agenda. But I think, as all three of our speakers have spent a good portion of their lives helping us come to focus on and understand, the problems are significantly deeper. And that's part of what we're trying to think about tonight in terms of an agenda, the question of the post-civil rights agenda. Our principal speaker tonight is John Jacob, whom it's a great honor to welcome back here to the Kennedy School. John is president of the National Urban League, the oldest American organization working for black and other minority rights. His personal history is illustrative both of the problems that the civil rights agenda addressed and to the progress that's been made. John grew up sharing a small 3-room house without indoor plumbing with 7 members of his family in Houston, Texas. His father was a Baptist minister who supplemented a small income with construction and carpentry work on the side. John's parents believed a great deal in discipline, as anybody who knows John can see instantly. And with the help of an ROTC scholarship, he attended Howard University, where he graduated with a BA in social work in 1957. Howard University, which he currently serves as vice chairman of. Then John went to look for a job, a first professional job, before the Civil Rights Act, and John learned a bit more about prejudice than he had known previously. After months of frustration, the only job he could find was as a postal clerk. And he later said of that experience, and I quote, "I hated the work. I went to work mad. I came home mad." Maybe it served a useful purpose in the sense that he went on to translate that anger into some agenda, but that's all it served. Finally, after 3 years of effort, John found work in his chosen field as a public assistance caseworker in Baltimore. While he was earning his master's degree in social work from Howard, he advanced to become Baltimore's child welfare supervisor. In 1965, John joined the Urban League staff as Director of Education and Youth Incentives in Washington, D.C. He then became successively Director of the San Diego chapter in 1970, President of the Washington Urban League, National Executive Vice President, and in 1982, he was unanimously chosen to succeed Vernon Jordan as the national president. Vernon chose to hand the baton to John at a period of rough sledding. Federal grants to the organization had been slashed by over half, and were slashed by over half, between 1980 and 84. The League was faced with the Reagan administration's opposition to affirmative action programs and support of cuts in welfare and job training. John responded creatively across the board, reaching out to develop new sources of funding for the organization, calling for the federal government to create a Marshall Plan for the nation's urban infrastructure and to achieve full employment through public works and job training programs, talking about subjects that had been publicly taboo, especially in the black community, organizing a black family summit in 1984, instituting a male responsibility project to reduce teenage pregnancy, just to mention a few of the initiatives. He's also been very active in the demonstrations against South Africa. In a time when black leadership is being challenged from many sides across the United States, John has stood as a beacon. As one of his league's colleagues commented on his selection, and again I quote, it says, quote, "It was good for the soul to see virtues such as hard work, confidence, commitment, and loyalty rewarded." So it's a very great pleasure to welcome back John Jacob.
Thank you very much, Dean Allison. I ordinarily do not correct statements on me in introductions, but in this forum, it's probably appropriate. All of what you said essentially is true, but I did not go to college on an ROTC scholarship. I don't even know how that got started, but I know where you got it from because I read the same thing and tried to correct it. The truth of the matter is that an old white slum landlord by the name of E.E. Worthen died in 1952 and left $500,000 in scholarship funds for poor but black kids to go to college. That's how I got to college. Secondly, I really didn't major in social work. I majored in economics. I kind of backed into social work because I understood economics. I was working at the welfare department, and they had a graduate degree program where they paid you $3,600 a year to go to school full-time to get a master's, and they paid you $40 a year to work full-time and not go to school. I lived in Washington and commuted to Baltimore. It just seemed economically reality to me. If I could make $400 less but go to school full-time and stay at home, that it made sense to go to school. I mean, that's how I got into social work. I wish I could tell you that I started out wanting to help all these people, but to tell you I can count. And so that is really how I got into the business. But that is not what I came here to discuss. But I do think that it's important in this forum to get the record straight. It is true that all the other things that were said. I'm delighted to share this forum with my good friend Professor Lowry and to meet Professor Kennedy for the first time. And I am indeed pleased to be back at the Kennedy School to share with you some of my thoughts on this subject. America today is in the midst of a national debate on the proper role of government in dealing with social problems, chief among them the disproportionate poverty and social disorganization affecting the black community. During much of the post-war era, that debate centered on how institutional structures could secure civil rights for black citizens and help minorities enter the mainstream of American life. In recent years, the terms of the debate have changed. Under the leadership of an administration that labels government itself as the enemy, the debate centers more and more on how government can effect a strategic withdrawal from social policy. Today's great river of debate is being fed by many streams of thoughts. They range from the belief that government has an inescapable duty to implement positive social policies, to the view that anything government does is likely to worsen existing problems and create new ones. Some also suggest black problems are rooted in behavior and values beyond the reach of public policy. To place the current debate in context, I would like to suggest several propositions. One, that federal policies have historically promoted economic and social mobility. Second, that federal policies have led to significant black advances. And third, that current government policies have intensified the problems facing black and poor people. American history shows the extent to which government policies shaped opportunities, from the institution of free public education to free land to subsidized railways. Washington's policies always served social ends. Some of today's critics of social policies were educated under the GI Bill, bought houses with FHA loans, owned businesses started with SBA loans, are treated in VA hospitals, drive to work on federally subsidized highways, educate their children with federally guaranteed loans, and look forward to retirement income from Social Security. Government bailed out Chrysler. It publicly states that it will not allow large banks to fail. It subsidizes farm interests. Even rugged individualists from the oil patch run to Washington for welfare. Given that record, the argument that government has no role to play in social policy rings hollow. Government policies created a large middle class and preserves the wealth of the affluent. Government should play an equally decisive role in providing opportunities for the poor. When the federal government did intervene to protect black rights and reduce poverty, its efforts were by and large successful. They helped millions out of poverty, secured civil rights for black citizens, and despite the Reagan counter-revolution, continued to provide opportunities. Contrary to today's myths, affirmative action and social programs worked. Affirmative action increased black employment opportunities. A Labor Department study found that federal contractors under affirmative action mandates, increased minority employment and promotions at a far higher rate than other employers. Poverty was sharply reduced in the late 1960s, with about half of the decline directly due to government transfer payments. In those years, too, the income gap between black and white families narrowed. In the 1960s, hunger was a serious national problem. Thanks to food stamps, it virtually disappeared from the national agenda until recently. Federal education aid helped raise black children's performance on basic skills tests. Head Start resulted in higher school achievement and better social adjustment. Student aid programs were instrumental in the five-fold increase in black college attendance. The Job Corps and other programs targeted to the disadvantaged opened employment opportunities for many. Black infant mortality rates were almost halved thanks to Medicaid and nutrition programs. At a time when cutting such programs is becoming an article of faith among some who consider themselves conservatives, we should recall that conservative columnist George Will wrote, and I quote, "It is cheaper to feed the child than jail the man. Persons who do not understand this are not conservatives, just dim," end of quote. It is also dim to brand such programs as tax wasters. Evidence suggests they pay for themselves. For example, successful job training programs typically return $3 to $4 for every dollar spent in training costs. A congressional study recently estimated that the Women, Infants, and Children program saves $3 for every $1 spent by reducing future hospitalization costs. Cost-benefit ratios for other programs were found to range from 1.5 to 1 to 10 to 1. The Reagan era has seen a reversal of federal policy, a shift away from intervention to neglect. The result has been to worsen the conditions of poor and black Americans. Between 1979 and 1984, real dollar income for the poorest fifth of families with children declined by 24%, and the income gap between whites and blacks grew. Overall, poverty rates rose by a third. More than a third of all black people, over 9 million, are poor today, 2 million more than in 1978. But federal programs were severely cut. Between 1981 and 1984, years of deep recession and slow recovery, 4 million people lost welfare, Medicaid, supplemental security insurance, and food stamps. Benefits were reduced for millions more. The deepest cuts came in programs that invest in education and employment skills, such as job training, which was cut by more than half. There is a distinction that we should make among welfare programs between universal programs affecting everyone and means-tested programs designed for the poor. Universal programs like Social Security have not been touched for political reasons. But black people are less likely to reap the benefits of such programs because they die too young or earn too little to fully share in the payoff. But blacks typically account for 30 to 40% of participants in means-tested programs. And the cuts in those programs reduced the income of poor families by 7.5% and drove 2 million people into poverty. The Congressional Budget Office reports a massive transfer of wealth from low-income families to the affluent. The tax and budget changes reduced income of low and moderate income families by $20 billion between 1983 and 1985, while increasing the after-tax income of the wealthiest 2% by $35 billion. Those who believe that government can and should devise policies that reduce inequality and poverty can point to some considerable past successes. Those who believe that government cannot and should not implement such policies must defend the results of current policies that have dramatically increased inequality and poverty. Their only recourse is to say that market forces, unimpeded by government interference, will create wealth and jobs. That view has only a tenuous relationship to reality. It ignores the persistence of discrimination and its effects. It embodies a fantasy of blacks and whites lining up at the starting line as equals, when reality is that black people run the race of life, carrying heavy historical and present burdens on their shoulders. Everything we know about race and poverty in America suggests that unless the poor are given some extra help in the form of social policies that enlarge their opportunities, they will not compete on equal terms with the affluent. The results of the current economic recovery bears that out. We are in the longest sustained economic recovery in memory, and the results are barely perceptible in poverty communities. Unemployment and poverty are far higher than they were before the recession. Jobless rates for every group, including white men of prime working age, are higher than they were in 1979. Black unemployment, which was 6.7% in 1970, is stuck at 15%, more than double the white rate. Black unemployment has been in the double digits since the mid-1970s, a 13-year depression with no end in sight. An April survey of business leaders found that while they expect the boom to continue, 70% predict their employment roles will either decline or be unchanged this year. Economic growth alone cannot create sufficient employment opportunities for the poor and for the unskilled. Some argue that even with supportive government policies, many will remain poor because they have neither the skills nor the attitudes to allow them to escape poverty. That view has become an article of faith among the neoconservatives and the neoliberals who dominate the current debate. While there is a grain of truth to the argument, it totally neglects the way people adapt to extreme situations, such as poverty in the midst of affluence. And it leads us into the blind alley of refusing to do anything about the root cause of poverty, the lack of opportunity. The scars borne by those who have been brutalized by poverty and discrimination are deep, but skills can be acquired and attitudes changed. The primary factor is opportunity. People respond to opportunities. Studies show that children whose parents work do better in school. They see a real-world link between their studies and employment. Dropout rates are lower where students are promised jobs or college admission upon graduation. Other programs demonstrate the eagerness of welfare mothers to obtain skills and jobs. So you can't write off 35 million people who happen to be poor. In all essentials other than income, they are not appreciably different from the rest of us. That is important to remember at a time when the policy debate increasingly centers on the black family. Half of all black families are headed by single women, and over 2/3 of poor black children live in those families. The rise in female-headed households is blamed for the rise in black poverty. It is further asserted that there has been a breakdown in moral values leading to family instability and welfare dependency. Those assumptions are wrong. The central cause of black poverty and black family instability is the lack of economic opportunity. The rise in female-headed families is directly linked to the decline in black male employment. In 1960, almost 3/4 of black families were intact, and almost 3/4 of black men had jobs. In 1985, only half of black families are intact, and only about half of black men have jobs. Even as the economy successfully absorbed a massive influx of white females into the labor force, it failed to provide jobs for the black unemployed, with terrible results for black family stability. The breakdown in economic opportunities cut across racial lines. Teenage pregnancy, out-of-wedlock births, and female-headed households are typical to poor white communities as well as black ones. The web of behavior patterns labeled by some as pathological and by others as dysfunctional is driven by abject poverty and hopelessness. So while it is convenient to argue that family instability causes poverty, it is more accurate to say that poverty causes family instability. The dependency issue is largely a sham. Some people may settle into long-term dependence on welfare, but most move in and out of the welfare system depending on circumstances. Nor is there proof that welfare encourages formation of single-parent households. Since 1970, inflation cut welfare benefits by 1/3, and there was a drastic increase in the percentage of children in female-headed households. But the percentage of children in families on welfare remained stable. So I see no evidence that welfare contributes to family instability, but I see plenty of evidence that the welfare system is not reaching enough of the poor with enough assistance. Welfare reaches only about 3/4 of eligible families, excluding over 2 million poor people, mostly children, and benefits do not even begin to approach the artificially low poverty line. Over 1/3 of the poor aged do not receive supplemental security insurance benefits. Most eligible women, infants, and children who qualify for federal nutrition programs do not get aid. About 10 million people eligible for food stamps do not get them. Less than 1/4 of eligible households are in the low-income energy assistance program. Head Start reaches less than 1/5 of eligible children, and federal training programs reach only a small fraction of those eligible. Social welfare policy in America are not characterized by wide participation and generosity, but by very low participation and meanness. Poverty existed in the past, and as I have pointed out, poverty rates were significantly higher than they were after the Great Society programs. But America was different then. Most Americans had low and moderate income, but there was an abundance of jobs and for unskilled laborers. Men might not have earned much, but they had jobs, salaries, and self-respect. They were able to assume traditional family roles. Over the past 2 decades, however, we have seen the systematic destruction of unskilled jobs, including high-paying jobs in auto factories and steel plants. Today, blacks are concentrated in industries most affected by job losses and by competition from imports. They live in cities where low-wage manufacturing jobs were replaced by office and skilled service jobs. Blacks didn't leave jobs. Jobs left blacks. So the real issue in public policy is not whether federal social programs encourage dependency, but whether they offer opportunities to survive the ravages of extreme poverty and opportunities to participate in the economy. That does not exclude internal community efforts we call self-help. Blacks have been picking themselves up by their bootstraps ever since we've been here, even when we didn't have boots. Today, that tradition continues. In literally hundreds of communities, we see creative programs initiated and run by black community-based civil rights organizations and neighborhood groups, ranging from economic development to housing management to food banks. There is a growing myth today that civil rights organizations are busy fighting yesterday's battles and neglecting today's. Nothing could be further from the truth. I know of no major civil rights group that says civil rights strategies are the only way to improve black conditions. But because discrimination remains a stubborn factor in our society, it is a necessary part of our activities. Despite their diversity, civil rights leadership has been consistent in saying that while racism is still a problem, we cannot let it become an excuse. At the same time, those organizations are busy fighting for social policies that would advance the interests of the black poor and of the white poor, who vastly outnumber them. And they are deeply involved in efforts to cut the teenage pregnancy rate, to raise educational expectations and achievements, and to constructively deal with a host of community problems. The Urban League is intensively involved in a two-front war, working to change national social policies, while at the same time working within the black community to expand opportunities. We targeted key black family issues, such as teenage pregnancy and female-headed households, as priority concerns long before national television discovered them. This year, we will launch a major 5-year effort to mobilize the black community to improve our schools, a program designed to raise black student performance with measurable goals and timetables. So blacks do not need any lectures about self-help. We are helping ourselves. And it is instructive that the people most deeply involved in those self-help efforts are often the same people who demand more positive national social policies. Precisely because we are the poorest and most vulnerable part of our society, we know there is no substitute for policies that provide employment and training opportunities and create the conditions that make self-help efforts feasible. We know that black poverty cannot be significantly altered without changes in social policy. Yes, there is much that black people can do and are doing for themselves, but the place of blacks in our society will ultimately be determined by national policies that provide opportunities and make full use of all of America's human resources. I believe that such policies will eventually be adopted because they are in the national interest. Changing demographics mean that a third of new entrants into the labor force are non-white. A severe labor shortage is predicted before the end of the century. Unless we equip our neglected minorities with the education and the skills to fully participate in a post-industrial economy, America can expect second-class economic status, a weakened world position, and deep unrest at home. Rather than commit suicide for the sake of anti-government ideology, I believe America will return to a more activist social policy. We have only limited time tonight, so I can only sketch the outlines of a policy aimed at reducing poverty and inequality and increasing opportunities. I would suggest that those goals can be met by a targeted, sustained, three-part national effort. It would include, 1, a universal employment and training system that ensures jobs and training for all. It would include private and voluntary sector participation and provide skills training for jobs that will be in short supply, along with support services to reach and motivate participants. 2, education reform that equalizes opportunities for children in poor families, offer quality preschool learning experiences, and ensure that students are equipped with employable skills and with the services to help them move from the world of school to the world of work. 3, social welfare policies that stress human development and ensure decent living standards for all of the needy while providing child care and support services that encourage work. I believe such a national effort would go far to end poverty and dependency in America, secure social justice, and launch our economy into the 21st century. The halting steps taken in the social programs of the 1960s and 1970s should be seen as extensive research and development into what works and what doesn't. Today, we are well placed to frame effective programs that avoid past mistakes, including the mistake of untargeted, underfunded, and underutilized programs that promise more than they could deliver. Public policy today is at an impasse. It is dominated by an ideology that rejects government involvement, an ideology bankrupted by tolerating gross human suffering, and by its inability to meet the demands of global economic reality. In its more humane form, it offers a futile belief in self-help efforts that are not fully adequate to the needs of 35 million poor people living in affluence in an affluent post-industrial society. Absent an activist government social policy, we are left with what I call the if-only alternatives. If only poor people acted like middle-class people, if only poor people didn't have so many children, if only blacks would stop complaining. The if-only school of thinking is an exercise in racial fantasy. It avoids social problems instead of confronting them. And it feeds the false assumption that nothing can be done about our problems. There is an air of desperation about some of the if-only beliefs, a hunger for quick fixes like supply-side economics or doing away with minimum wage and occupational health and safety laws, or preaching to kids not to engage in sex. But the real desperation today is in the poverty-stricken streets of urban black neighborhoods. It is in the eyes of hungry children, overburdened women, and hopeless men. It's a desperation that can and must be countered by national policies that replace bitterness with hope, failure with accomplishment, and hunger with food, training, and jobs. President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, and I quote, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little." 50 years later, those words remained as public policy guides that recognize government's responsibility to create opportunities for all. And I thank you.
To comment on our topic, the black community in the post-civil rights era, and make some comments on John Jacobs' remarks as well. Our first speaker or commenter is Randall Kennedy, an assistant professor at Harvard's Law School. Randall received his BA at Princeton and spent 2 years at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar before he went to Yale Law School, where he graduated and was the note and topics editor of the Yale Law Journal. In 1982, he served as law clerk in the U.S. Court of Appeals, and in 1983, he clerked for Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. A contributor to the Harvard Law Review, The Nation, The New Republic, and The American Lawyer, among others, Randall joined the Harvard faculty in 1984 and specializes in civil rights and contracts. So we welcome here.
Thank you. I agree with much of what Mr. Jacobs had to say. His message in support of the basic idea that government is responsible for the well-being of citizens, all citizens, is decent and responsible and essential insofar as we must counter the propositions of those who prescribe the application of intensified misery as a tool of social policy. So I agree with much of what you had to say. I guess it's a question of distinctions here, a question of difference. I guess I would try and push your basic tenet a little bit further. The basic problem that I see is that with your comments are that I have a far better impression of what you're against than what you are for. You're clearly against the ravages of poverty. You're clearly against joblessness in general and racially disproportionate joblessness in particular. You're clearly against public policies inattentive to these problems. I'm less certain, however, of your position with respect to the basic question, what do we want? What should be our vision for the future? Do we want the racial integration of the American social hierarchy as it stands? Or do we ultimately want an egalitarian society without social hierarchy? Do we want merely to ameliorate the rigors of poverty, as you suggested? Or do we want to do away with poverty altogether? To the extent that one can infer a social vision from your comments, it seems to me that it is a vision that is all too modest. It is a defense of the welfare state as defined by the New Deal, by the Great Society, and by the war on poverty. But that vision of the welfare state is itself too limited. Your comments seem to me to be captured to a degree by the treachery of nostalgia. In 1966, Bayard Rustin, in an important essay, stated, and this is at the height of the Great Society, 1966, over 20 years ago, Bayard Rustin stated that standing still to stay in place is the present condition of the Negro. We're going to have to go a lot further than anything that was contemplated by the Great Society. Let me be a little bit more particular here. And to be more particular, I'm going to have to go outside of Mr. Jacobs' remarks tonight and refer instead to comments he made in the opening essay of the National Urban League's publication, The State of Black America in 1986. Defending the good name of Great Society liberalism, Mr. Jacobs states the following: "We know that programs to take people out of poverty can work if they are constructed carefully, managed properly, and adequately funded." With this, I agree. But then there's this following. One example is provided by the 27 skills training centers the National Urban League operates in concert with IBM and other business firms to train the unemployed and underemployed in computer programming, clerical secretarial skills, computer operations, and word processing. A number of the enrollees are single female heads of households, others are former school dropouts, and still others possess limited skills that are no longer in demand on the job market. After training, which costs a little over $3,000 for each participant, some 85% of the graduates are placed in jobs at an average annual salary of some $12,600. This is put forward as a success. This is put forward as an exemplary indication of what social policy in its positive form can do. Well, perhaps if we lived in a more fully developed welfare system than we currently have, a figure of $12,600 might not be so bad. Perhaps if one lived in the most inexpensive part of the United States imaginable, $12,600 might not be so bad. But for me, the idea of raising a family in Cambridge or Boston or New York or Washington, D.C., or any of the other places I'm familiar with, I would approach the $12,600 success with great trepidation. $12,600 is half the median income of households in the United States. It's a little more than $1,000 over the official, which is to say the false, poverty level. What the Bureau of Labor Statistics refers to as a low budget is $18,900. this budget enables a family to maintain what the Bureau of Labor Statistics calls a sense of dignity and social participation, if that's the case, what are the implications for the graduates of the skills training centers? Well, the best way to conceptualize the problem is simply to personalize it. How would I feel like with a future with $12,600 as my income in the United States as presently constituted? To be sure, this is just one example, but I think it is a representative example of public policy thinking which, while certainly more humane than right-wing alternatives, is nonetheless insufficiently aware of concrete human needs and insufficiently demanding of a society that prides itself on its widely trumpeted democratic aspirations. One more point. To be sufficiently ambitious social policy concerned with the requisites of social justice, we will have to take into account more than just welfare issues. We will have to take into account more than just so-called black issues. We will have to take into account the entire gamut of issues that affect the allocation of resources in the nation. The tax system, the military system, the relationship between levels of government in our complicated federal system. All of these issues must be addressed, and they must be addressed in an open frame of mind, not afraid to consider and propose and fight for revolutionary changes. As Bayard Rustin put it over 20 years ago, the Negro's struggle for equality in America is essentially revolutionary. While most Negroes in their hearts unquestionably seek only to enjoy the fruits of American society as it now exists, their quest cannot objectively be satisfied within the framework of existing political and economic relations. Therefore, in my view, what is most required of us in this post-civil rights era is the detailed elaboration of a new framework, the sort of framework that we most desire, not the sort of framework that might be most politically feasible at the present moment. I'm making a call for utopian thinking. I'd say we need to think in a detailed way about the sort of framework for which we are willing to sacrifice, the sort of framework for which we are willing to dream, the sort of framework for which we are willing to struggle. Thank you.
Darrell and Cynthia promised John that we would not just let him hear two echoes of his remarks, but that we would get an array of opinion here, and I think that Randall has gotten us started. Our cleanup hitter is a local boy made good, Glenn Lowry, who's a professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School. Glenn is a native of Chicago's South Side who once dropped out of school to work in a factory. But inspired by his father, who threatened to disown him, he went to junior college, won a scholarship to Northwestern University, and earned a doctorate in economics at MIT. He then taught at Northwestern, moved on to the University of Michigan, and finally came to Harvard in 1982. One of the leading critics of the welfare system, affirmative action, and liberal black leadership, but from a perspective slightly different than Randall's, Glenn is frequently published in journals including the Review of Black Political Economy, the American Economic Review, and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. He's also been a consulting economist for the Rockefeller Foundation, AT&T, and the Federal Trade Commission, and the Joint Economic Committee for the U.S. Congress. For those of you students here in the school who wonder where has he been lately, Glenn is on leave this year at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies, but we're glad to have him back tonight to comment on this. Glenn Lowry.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm very glad to be back here to comment tonight, and I'm really very pleased to have the opportunity to participate in this forum. based on some of the things that Graham said and somehow my reputation, one might get the impression that I never met a civil rights leader that I liked. That's false. I like John Jacob very much, not just as a man, but for what he stands for and for the way in which, in an extremely difficult position, he has led his historic and, I believe, continuing to be important organization. It's not an easy job to be a civil rights leader in 1986. I mean, after all, this panel is titled the post-civil rights era. I mean, that almost suggests unemployment for a civil rights leader. And indeed, the simplicity of the struggle that was, however imposing, nonetheless straightforward in 1956 or in 1965 has dwindled away. It's no longer quite nearly the same issue. It's not just the enemy without. It's not just racism, although it is that, and it's not just opportunity, though it certainly is that. But it is a set of problems of mounting urgency and importance that involve in highly complex ways that I don't know that any social scientist can claim to fully understand. The behaviors of adolescents in particular in the inner cities of this country that are interacting with historical and ongoing denial of opportunity to create very serious problems. And the job of a civil rights leader today is complicated by changes in the external political environment, complicated by the evident onset of an era of retrenchment, indeed, possibly accurately characterized as an era of reaction. And in such an environment, rhetoric, discourse can't proceed as it ordinarily might. One has to look over one's shoulder. One has to be mindful of how it is that what one says about the urgent problems of unwed pregnancy or criminal victimization, welfare dependency, school performance, how it is that what one says about those urgent problems get translated into symbolic and national political rhetoric. When there are enemies without, mean-spirited parties who would use a frank and open discussion of those problems to effect retrenchment and reaction, a shrinkage of the size of the state, indeed a repudiation of the legitimacy of claiming public responsibility for the problems of the poor, then one who has the job of a civil rights leader today has to tread carefully, has to be mindful of these pitfalls. And I think that if one listened carefully and read between the lines of Mr. Jacobs' remarks tonight, you would see he was mindful of these difficulties and artfully attempting to manage them. I want to suggest that it's not just the left-right problem that we're confronted with now when we talk about the problems of poor blacks. It's not only a problem of the size of the welfare state, of the state of realignment, of the extent to which conservative ideas went out over liberal ideas, of whether or not the 1960s was a good idea, of if the spirit of Reagan is what will animate the late 1980s and early 1990s in this country. It's that, but it's not only that. There is confronting one who would lead blacks today also another dimension, a question of, if I could stretch this term a bit, nationalism at the sub-national level, a question of group cohesion and solidarity, a question of identity. There is today the question of how one makes use of the undoubted expansion of black economic and political power, which has occurred in the last 20 years, which is self-evident, which is symbolically represented by the very fact of this meeting, among many, many other things that could be seen within 5 minutes' walk of Harvard Square, how one makes use of that change to address the problems of the inner city. This is an urgent issue for me. Part of what I have been trying to get at in my advocacy of self-help is not, I stress again, the left-right question, the question of public action versus voluntarism, the question of what should be the size of the philanthropic sector vis-a-vis the transfer sector in meeting these problems. But it's been, in a way, attempting to address the question of motivation and of involvement. If you like, the issue of the social relations of helping, as distinct from Marx's conception of the social relations of production. Exactly what are the relationships among persons concerned about each other that have to be present in order to effect the kinds of transformations that are necessary. So I want to sort of note that at the outset here, that I don't think the question is only one of how conservative am I. I don't think the dimensions are, the relevant space for conceiving this problem is one-dimensional, and we're either so far to the right or so far to the left. And it's the interaction between those two things, between how one mobilizes a community and sustains a sense of involvement in one's fellows on the one hand, and how one also deals with the large public questions of the role of the state on the other, that creates much of the difficulty for a civil rights leader today. Now, having said that, let me turn to the four themes that I wanted to base my remarks upon tonight. One of them is that we face here, when we talk about the problem of racial inequality, one of the central issues confronting the country today, a problem of enormous urgency, one that would be approached with the attitude of benign neglect by the central government, only by men and women running that government who lack understanding and who would, if they understand, be derelict in their responsibilities to the country if they didn't address themselves to this issue forthrightly. I have myself recently been critical of the Reagan administration for precisely the perception that, given their views and the ideological array to the left or right about what will work or what won't in social policy, I've perceived there's nonetheless been a reticence to act on whatever they think will work in order to address this issue. That is, people who've criticized by saying, well, this just doesn't seem to be important to these people, seem to have cogent criticisms, and that irrespective of whether or not one thinks it's urban enterprise zones or urban development action grants that are to be the vehicle of affecting the change, there is the additional question of simply recognizing the urgency of the issue. Mr. Jacob referred in his remarks to the threat to the domestic peace of the society that is implicit in the ongoing state of affairs. That is quite evident. I would just further add that this phenomenon takes place, this problem, within a historical context. We do deal here, as Randall Kennedy suggested, with the aftermath of an incomplete revolution. We have had a civil rights revolution, but we have not had a revolution in terms of the problems of exclusion, of civic marginality of the black working and lower class in particular. And that structural inequality, by virtue of having a racial tone and of occurring within a society that has the racial history that we have, is not just a problem of income distribution or of inequality. It's a much more profound problem that goes right to the root of the national character of the American people. Indeed, it calls into question the possibility of using the word the American, the phrase the American people, and being true to the circumstance that we face. So there is an urgency, and that's one thing I want to stress. The second theme I'd like to mention is that in confronting these problems, the ideas that come from intellectuals, how we conceive of the problem, how we frame it is extremely important. We have a debate going on today about welfare reform. Charles Murray's book is all the rage, in which he argues that attempts to help have actually made people worse. Mr. Jacob referred to that at least implicitly and presented summarized some data that suggests that thesis is not directly accurate, and I concur in that judgment. I mean, my own sense of rather like reducing that problem to that simple one-dimensional framework that I was talking about earlier. It's rather like saying that the question is either for liberals that we should be spending more or for conservatives that we should be spending less. I really don't think that that's enough. I would recall to your attention, Senator Moynihan was here giving these Godkin lectures last year. His recently published book has gotten a lot of attention. I'd recall for you the events surrounding the release of his report in 1965 about the black family. The black family is today all the rage. Some people are tired of hearing about it, and there are these concerns as to how it's characterized. But it's important to note that, as a matter of fact, these issues were brought to the public attention, and one doesn't have to buy Moynihan's explanation or his prescription to acknowledge, as I think we safely can in 1986, that the issue that he raised was of fundamental importance to any persons concerned about equality between the races in the United States, and that the way in which it was dealt with, the nature of the public discourse, of the ensuing rhetoric about it, was in retrospect, unfortunately, not sufficiently rich to entertain all the sets of policy possibilities that needed to be considered to deal with this problem. It's tempting, emotionally, intellectually, to see the problems of the inner city as being essentially problems of opportunity, the lack of jobs, industrial shifts, relocation of firms, information society, service society, and so forth. It's tempting. And there is more than a grain of truth in it. But it's not enough. It's not, at least to me, totally intellectually satisfying. We have in inner city Newark, or Trenton, or Camden, or North Philadelphia, places I happen to live close to now, or Chicago, or the east side of Detroit, or South Central Los Angeles, or so many other places that could be named. We have going on there something a little bit more than the absence of opportunity. How we conceive about it, how we conceive of the problem, how we frame it, what things we're willing to talk about with respect to it and not, are fundamentally important. In 1965, we weren't ready to deal with the full extent of the problem. We were still in a circumstance a bit too sensitive and tenuous regarding the nature of public commitment to adequately look at what's going on. But I think that we have something of a luxury today in addition to the 20 years experience that we have. I think that now a set of ideas that will embrace a broader range of human activity than the labor market are going to be required in order to understand and then ultimately to effectively intervene with the problems that are going on in the inner city today. Moreover, it is quite clear that the role of the legal side of the civil rights strategy with respect to school desegregation, with respect to employment discrimination, with respect to whether or not Grove City College can be exempt from regulatory requirements and so on, that edge of the revolution has diminished in the extent to which it can effectively address the problems that are confronting the inner city poor. A cursory review of the developments in the law and in social practice in the school desegregation area, I think, compels that conclusion. Boston is an obvious case in point. This is not a repudiation of the effort. It is not a suggestion that perpetual vigilance with respect to discrimination in education is not necessary. It's only the observation that the returns from this strategy of having federal courts intervene to affect the nature of pupil assignments to schools by race, the efficacy of that mode of intervention has shown itself to be, while positive, less than what's necessary to actually get the job of educating these children done. Well, that's evidently been recognized by people like Mary Futrell and William Gray and Floretta McKenzie, who's superintendent of the Washington, D.C. schools, and Manfred Byrd, who's superintendent of the Chicago public schools, as they have joined with Alvin Poussant here at Harvard and Arthur Thomas, the president of Central State University, to create a committee of concerned and powerful black Americans to look into improving the pedagogy of teaching language skills to inner city students and trying to use the enhanced administrative influence of blacks in the school committees and school administrative apparatuses of the big cities where most black kids go to school to affect these improvements. So ideas matter. It's not just a matter of opportunity. The debate over social policy is not only a question of how big the welfare budget is going to be, and the civil rights framework, vitally important, the preservation of which must be attended to, is not of itself adequate to get at these problems. This is something that is, I know, understood by Mr. Jacob, as was indicated in his remarks. The third theme is the matter of dignity, the question of honor. I have riled more than one observer with my willingness to entertain this question, for it raises a fairly fundamental issue. Black Americans in a society where historically achievement has not been acknowledged, where to tell someone all you have to do is do the job right and do it well and you'll get your due has been a fool's advice. You couldn't rely on getting your due. One had to be ever vigilant. Whatever one enjoyed, one had to wrest from an unwilling majority that was reticent to acknowledge actual accomplishment. Well, I want to advance for you the possibility that that circumstance has substantially changed, that there is another problem alongside the historic problem of the failure to recognize achievement, and that's the problem of the failure of achievement. That is the problem of performance, the problem of inadequate taking advantage of opportunities that actually exist. The problem that attends a substantial fraction of a people over a long period of time being in the posture of being dependent on transfers from others and having to make use of their historical violation as a device to legitimate the continuation of those transfers. I want to be understood here. I am not saying that there has not been historic violation, nor that that historic violation does not warrant consideration within our contemporary political discourse. I'm saying that for people who are manifestly unequal as a historical and contemporary fact and strive for equality, part of what needs to be attained in the seeking of their goal is the movement from that posture of dependency and of sort of bringing forth a plea to an evidently superior party, a movement from that posture to one in which people actually stand as equals. And in order to stand as equals, people have to ultimately be responsible for their fate and have to embrace their role in the determination of it. This is a subtle matter. It's not a rejection of the environmental influence. It's not a assertion that there is no external constraining force, but rather it's an acknowledgement that as long as one remains in the posture of ever appealing to the existence of that force as the explanation for one's failure to act or to effectively act, as long as one is in effect in the posture of trading, of brokering the sufferings of one's ancestors like chits across the table for another incremental amount on the welfare state. Indeed, if one slips into the position of making use of the sufferings of one's ancestors as excuses for the failure to perform currently, that one risks actually giving up the possibility of being genuinely equal in the society. One risks slipping in the position of being permanent ward. Let me just mention this last matter, and this is the question of values. The question of behavior in the adolescent population in the inner city, and the question of the role of private internal activity within the group as opposed to public and external activity in addressing those matters. One, obviously, for reasons that I've tried to touch on a bit tonight already, has to be careful in how it is that one poses this question. It is not appropriate to label an entire group of people, be they black Americans or be they people below the poverty line, as pathological, as deviant, as unlike us. On the other hand, it seems impossible to me to confront the real problems of safety in public housing projects, of drug sales in inner city low-income communities, of criminal victimization of people who are the most vulnerable in the society, without dealing with the underlying substratum of values and beliefs and attitudes that govern the behavior of the relatively few persons within a given community who are engaging in these actions. It seems impossible to me to talk seriously about the teenage pregnancy problem in an entirely mechanistic fashion, as if we're only dealing with a question of financial incentives, or we're dealing with some compact, complete logical system in which we understand the relationships among the various variables. I don't think we do. I don't think we know entirely, and if one reads carefully the ethnographic literature on inner city communities and teenage pregnancy, this conclusion seems compelled to me. I don't think we know entirely what governs behavior. But we do know that how people are raised and what they're taught and what they believe in and what they think is right and wrong, and the criteria that they use to make distinctions among themselves as between those who warrant status and respect from their peers and those who do not. We do know that these matters are vitally important in this area. And again, to go back to that initial theme about the difficulty of being a civil rights leader today in an era of reaction when the evident and easy goals have already been achieved, how one manages to articulate a concern about these values and how one manages to develop the institutional framework for addressing them in that context is an extremely difficult problem. And again, I would point very positively to the efforts of the National Urban League in this direction. Their male responsibility campaign that Graham referred to in his initial remarks is a model of how it is that a national civil rights organization can leverage its good offices to significant effect in this area. Much, much more can be done, including the involvement of significant figures like athletes and entertainers in attempting to use their channels of communications with these adolescents to send messages about the kinds of behavior that are most in keeping with what it means to be black in the 1980s. I use that metaphor finally as I conclude to call your attention to another earlier sea change in the attitudes and values of black Americans that has continued to have a significant influence on us. That was associated with the black power and black consciousness developments of the mid and late 1960s. And that is the event in which Afro-Americans changed our name from being Negroes to being blacks, and all that attended the recognition of self that was conveyed by that change of names. Some will think this a minor matter. I think it is not. It's a quite significant event in the sociocultural history of Afro-Americans, to be sure. And it connoted a deeper transformation of consciousness among Afro-Americans, the rejection of the most obvious remnants of the self-hatred that had been developed out of the difficulties of our past, and a conscious embrace of our African heritage and a subsequent effect on intellectual and artistic developments in a wide array of fields. Very important set of events. This was not affected by any state action. It was not affected by any change in the set of opportunities confronting people. It was largely affected internal to the group, and I would advance for your critical consideration, through mechanisms that involve social sanction within the group of people who were saying to others who would not adapt to the changing environment that their behavior was unacceptable. You couldn't be black if you did this. What was wrong with you for not doing this? Well, the analogy may be somewhat strained. It may be wrong. It may not work. But I want to make it anyway, just to have you rebut it. Just to have you rebut it so I can learn something. And the point is that today, with respect to problems of teen pregnancy, with respect to 40% dropout rates in the Chicago or Detroit public schools, with respect to the violent brutalization of law-abiding and decent family-oriented black people in the poor and working-class communities of this country, we face an issue that might well warrant a mobilization of the same kind of coercive, although without the effect of law, devices within the group, the same kind of affirmative, aggressive assertion of this is who we are, and this is what we demand of people like us. It seems to me that that frontier, which I can only sketchily put forward for you tonight, is the real horizon that's offered by self-help. Self-help is not a simple kind of code word for retrenchment and diminution of the size of the state, or a kind of throwing up one's hands and saying, I can't do anything anymore. It's rather an evocation of the powerful possibilities latent in the still developing nationalism and mutual concern and association among black Americans that can be mobilized, I think, may be able to be mobilized to deal with these problems. Thank you.
let me now abuse or at least exercise the authority of the chair. Normally, our local work rules say we stop at 9:30, but I think after presentations like this, I'm going to say we're going to continue until 9:45 for questions. Those of you who have to go somewhere should feel free to go, but those who would like to put questions should stand up at one of the microphones, either here on the ground floor or on the second floor. We are here to hear our speakers and not your speeches, so questions are limited to 1 minute, and you can ask your question of any member of the panel or to all members of the panel. This forum is being taped for possible rebroadcast on public radio, so therefore you need to put your questions at the microphones, and we'll start here with microphone A.
I was quite interested in what was being said, but I was hopeful from all three parties that I would hear something more substantive relative to prescription for change. The description of the problem and the historical reference to it, I think, was very articulately put forward. However, I think we've been hearing that for quite some time. I want to hear at this point, in 1986, some real viable prescriptions that lead to the kind of change. Every one of you had very valid points, and I think this body, for the most part, shared them in varying degrees. But the important thing is, how do we get this collective black talent to work toward prescription for change in a collective environment? That's what I want to hear.
Spoken like a Boston City Councilor, and we're glad to have Bruce Bowling here. Okay, who wants to take a first shot? John?
Well, I'm not so sure that I don't think that there isn't a collective effort emerging in Black America to try to address many of the ills that we are articulating. As I view some of the critical problems, certainly that stand in the way of black people achieving their full potential. Problems, Glenn alluded to the whole issue of teenage pregnancy, or issues like single female-headed households, or issues like crime in black neighborhoods. What I see happening around the country are black groups, community organizations, community institutions mobilizing to try to put in place programs that would specifically deal to an obviation or an alleviation of those particular problems. The truth of the matter, though, is that, at least in my opinion, the major problems, problems like unemployment, problems like poverty, problems like hunger, are problems that are not going to get solved by self-help or the collection of black folks coming together, because they are national problems that require national policy and national resources. And that it seems to me that what is important in this whole scenario is that the black community make certain that it does not allow itself to get manipulated into the position where we have to solve those problems ourselves. We're talking about a third of black folks being poor. We're talking about half of all black children growing up in poor homes. With the magnitude of those kinds of problems, therefore, it seems to me, it becomes absolutely essential that we apply the kinds of pressures that suggest that there is a fundamental role that government must play, both in terms of providing leadership on a resolution of the problem and, more importantly, providing resources to address those problems in order to get those problems substantively dealt with.
Randall?
As I stated in my opening comments, I think that radical thinking is required, and on a more practical plane, I think we need to take a look at what forces are available to join up with that might be able to affect change on the ground. The force that I see on the horizon that best articulates what I think society should be about is the Rainbow Coalition. So as far as I'm concerned, one way to take a step forward to what I'm interested in is to link up with this political entity and to contribute to it, to talk to others about it, and to be a partisan in that cause. That would be one very concrete step as far as I can see it.
Okay. Glenn, for just a short answer?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you let yourself be called a professor of public policy, you ask for someone to come up to you and say, okay, what's the right public policy? So I asked for this. And the truth of the matter is, I don't really know what the panacea or solution is. If I did, I would have already said it, and everybody would be acting on it. There are some things that are happening. Governor Dukakis's education and training choices effort here in Massachusetts to train welfare mothers, expensive but cost beneficial, enjoying a high employment background, which every state can't call to, but nonetheless showing something that can be done. It seems to me is a pretty good example of what one can do. I mean, you could go on further and ask the question, if it's such a good idea for the women who choose it, maybe it would be permissible to try to use the influence of the state to compel participation in some such programs, or to make the receipt of benefits conditional upon involvement in some kind of programmatic activity that was going to ultimately lead to independence. I realize that's a big ideological step, and it's problematic in a lot of ways, but I mean, we can put it on the table. Education is another area. I mean, I happen to think that there's some exciting things going on at the local level in education. There's no doubt that there's been a dramatic improvement in Washington, D.C.'s public schools under the administration of the last two superintendents of education there. I can think of a small program in Detroit in 5 of their 22 high schools now called Efficacy Detroit that has evidently worked wonders in motivating their high school students that have participated in the program to avoid dropout, teen pregnancy, and lower rates of criminal participation. I know a group of blacks in Pittsburgh who are organizing Saturday morning schools to teach reading and mathematics to kids in the public schools in Pittsburgh in the basement of 20 churches. I know it's going to sound small. You're going to tell me, what's the effort in 20 churches in Pittsburgh got to do with the problems as massive as all they are? And I would say to you, like Chairman Miles says, let 100 flowers bloom. I mean, let's see what works in Pittsburgh. Let's see what works someplace else. But anybody who tells you after 20 years of school desegregation, after massive expenditures and declining SAT scores and increasing illiteracy rates and problematic dropout rates and astronomical drug consumption rates, anybody who tells you they've got the answers right here, let me just tell you what it is, Representative Bowling, they're lying. They don't know. So, I think a little bit of modesty on everybody's part and an openness to experimentation is needed.
Microphone B.
Hello. I'm at the undergraduate school across the street, and I hear about this talk about opportunities and these problems, and I'm not quite sure if you guys have done this before or you're in the process of doing it, but you seem to, all of you, have the various schools of thought about this problem. And I guess my question are going to be, first of all, and I guess if all three of you guys can answer this, do you want to solve the problem? If yes, can you gentlemen work together sort of as a group or a whole and bring in those respective schools of thought and come up with this, say, a national strategy for the black community and for the national community as a whole?
The answer to both of your questions is yes.
Yeah.
Disagreements? No. Microphone C.
Thank you. The question that I will ask has to do with political judgment, and I ask it to all three of the panelists. The argument of self-help is not new. I've been hearing it ever since I was a child. The argument of morality is not new. The argument of values is not new. The fact that black people have from the beginning had some problems with desegregation theories is not new. I think what people have done is made a political judgment and said that under certain circumstances, if they made their arguments publicly, they would be misused. I can remember coming from an educational conference at Mr. Jacobs' Urban League where people decided that some positions were important, but if they were stated publicly, they would be misused by this Reagan administration. And the last thing people wanted to have is to have Mr. Me supporting them publicly. I mean, it could be. It could shorten the life of a civil rights leader very quickly. The question that I ask is, inasmuch as people suspect that arguments that point to morality rather than the implementation of new programs can be used by conservative forces to undermine positive efforts, what kind of posture does one take if one accepts the role of leadership? Does one make the arguments because one thinks one should have open discourse, or does one make a political judgment that some arguments ought not be made at certain times because the dangers are greater if they're made publicly than privately?
May I ask you, John, go ahead.
My own view is that there are certain propositions that ought to be put on the public floor for debate and for discussion. I am probably one of the first people who put the whole issue of teenage pregnancy and single female-headed households and crime in black neighborhoods on the national agenda for debate. I happen to have thought that it was important, if we were ever to mobilize around the issue, to stop being defensive about it. I mean, we don't have to be defensive about it. Let's recognize it and try to do something about it. Where I think we talk too much is not on those kinds of issues. I think we talk too much on defining the plan, laying the plan out in public, and then presenting it to the public. Because I think any plan that you give to the American public, they will also find a way to defense it. And so I think that is where I draw the line on what we put out in the public domain. But in terms of putting the issues out in the public domain, I think we have to, and we have to take that risk. And it doesn't bother me that Bill Moyer would have done a show on the vanishing black family, and in my judgment, may have in fact misrepresented some of the points that the black community was trying to articulate. The reason it doesn't bother me is that in America, in my opinion, it's not a problem until people see it on television or read it in the newspapers. And that happens to be the American psychic, and that happened to have been a vehicle to at least raise to the consciousness of the country that these are problems that we have to do something about. I think black people have to become more comfortable with who we are and what we are, and not look to television or the white definitions of who we are, what we are.
On that issue of openness with discussion, and I guess I wouldn't take any absolute. Everything has to be put into context. But just as a general matter, it seems to me that open discussion is strengthening rather than weakening, and that on those occasions when people have attempted to suppress an issue or keep it behind closed doors, it has hurt us rather than helped us. For one thing, I mean, people aren't stupid. It's not as if ideas won't get out. Ideas will get out, and the best way for us to make up our own minds about ideas is to discuss them openly. So as a general matter, it would be the very unusual, the extraordinary circumstance in which I would think that the black community should engage in any sort of self-censorship. We live in just too open a society for that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I quickly basically agree with that. I mean, it's the issue here is not do they know, because they know. The issue is, do they know that we know? And do we know that they know that we know? Do you understand what I mean? Because everybody's talking about it. I mean, you can't drive through a bombed-out looking place with hookers on the corner and dope fiends on the corner and the bombed-out buildings and whatnot and not say, you know, when we lived in this neighborhood, it didn't look like this. Don't you think people are saying that? Don't you think they can see what the welfare statistics are and so forth? So there is a sense of maturity and confidence associated with acknowledging publicly the existence of something that privately is understood to everyone. And the failure for that acknowledgement to be made creates a kind of cynicism. Everybody's going around whispering. It invites lies and duplicity. And it's no way to get respect. It's no way ultimately to get equality in the society.
We're up at microphone D.
In view of Professor Lowry's frequent emphasis in much of what he's written on the importance of morality, I'd like to raise what might possibly be a question regarding political morality for Mr. Lowry. Mr. Allison, in recounting where Mr. Lowry's been recently, omitted one interesting, event, which is sort of part of the history of where Glenn's been last year. Late last summer, the early autumn, Mr. Lowry, with Peter Berger and a number of other individuals, went on a fact-finding trip to Southern Africa, partially underwritten by the Anglo-American Corporation. A number of individuals from the press tried to contact Mr. Lowry and didn't have calls returned. I raise this question because, in view of Mr. Lowry's emphasis on the importance of moral responsibility of leadership and the importance of internal moral consistency, I asked Mr. Lowry, one, what was the nature of the trip? Who were the other individuals that funded it? And what was the political morality that motivated it?
All right, I'll answer that question, though I don't like it. I don't like it for what it presumes about me, for what presumptions are not made in the question. This is not a question advanced by somebody who doesn't know me. I didn't just drop in from Mars and then go off to South Africa. So there is the kind of innuendo that smacks of McCarthyism in the question.
No, I just want just
but I'm
the
going
facts.
to answer the question.
Just the facts.
When I went to South Africa, there was not quite the atmosphere here at Harvard of meticulous sanitation about involvement with that circumstance that now exists. I was approached by a set of people who convinced me that they were interested in getting a broader view of that situation, particularly as it related to the interaction between political developments in South Africa and the formulation of American policy and the development of American advocacy.
Individuals that will remain disclosed, not disclosed?
Well, okay, you've already indicated
one of them.
Some of the people who were involved in the trip. But let me just go ahead and say what it is, and I'm going to say in response to your query. The question of morality here, as if there could be some guilt by association. You mentioned the name of Peter Berger. There would be the name of Richard Newhouse, who is a scholar and theologian in New York City, or of Heribert Adam, who is a political scientist at the University of British Columbia, or of Helen Kitchen, who is a political scientist at the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. All these people are experts in their respective fields. They vary in their political affiliations. They had in common a knowledge about and interest in the general subject of interaction between South African and American politics. And they agreed to explore the possibility of doing this study that, as you say, was partially financed by the Anglo-American Corporation, which is not a bad name either in South Africa nor should it be in the United States, in my judgment. I think actually that the people that I met and talked to from Anglo-American were among the most progressive of the business community in South Africa and have a role to play there. But just to put your question to rest, I decided to resign from the group after coming back from that trip, and did so shortly thereafter, and have not subsequently been involved with them. But that decision was based as a matter of judgment on what it is that I learned by going over there, and I decided to investigate the possibility initially in order to be able to make a judgment about whether or not it was worthwhile.
Okay. I think given where we are, I've been looking at our organizers over here trying to see what we should do, and I think we've come beyond the witching hour. I apologize very much to the people who are still up for questions. And what we'll have to do is, since a number of people have to go, you'll have to put your questions to the extent that folks can hang around here at the front for a few minutes after we close. But let me say, for our panelists, and especially for coming from New York to be with us, for John Jacobs, we want to say thank you very much indeed.